Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's class, which is on initial coding. So I'm going to use a lot of terms interchangeably throughout this class. So when I refer to initial coding, I'm sometimes going to refer to it as open coding, applying gerunds. Johnny Saldana refers to it as cycle one coding. We basically need a way to be able to break down large amounts of data so that we can build it up theoretically and thematically later on in the semester, or later on in our projects. So I'm going to share my PowerPoint for today, and we're going to get started learning all the skills we need related to being able to apply initial codes. So bear with me for a minute. Okay. So coding, we're going to learn this first cycle level initial coding method. And just bear in mind that it can be connected to grounded theory or any of the 5 approaches. Today in our reading, we learned about Sharma's version of initial coding, but we also read a chapter by Johnny Saldana. And Johnny Saldana is very general in his take on the approach to coding. So he hasn't linked it to a particular approach like grounded theory. His position is that this is a great technique to be able to break down data across all of the 5 approaches for any kind of project. So I first want to give us an overview of coding. So what do we mean and what are we looking for in our data when it comes to initial coding? So today we're going to learn about initial coding, and next week we're going to learn about focused coding, which is an entirely different technique. And remember, we're moving up different levels of abstraction. So we're moving from descriptive to abstract. So we're really focusing on what is happening in the data. We are describing what is happening using action. So remember, we are symbolic interactionists if we're influenced by pragmatism. So we believe that human beings are actors, doers, thinkers, engaged in a continuous stream of action. So this coding strategy helps us account for that. We train ourselves to not see instances in isolation, but as a part of a continuous stream of action that involves living life. So being able to apply these codes helps us suspend our codes from the data and helps us reorder things into looking at larger scale social processes. We also take the position that coding must be grounded in the participants' voices, so their very words. So we are also going to learn about an initial coding strategy that really carries up to higher levels of coding strategies later on, known as applying in vivo codes. So I want to take us through the whole process really quick of like what we are building in this course. So initial codes is the very first stage of coding. Then we move to focus codes, then we move to categories, and then we move to more theoretical or thematic development later on. So the first step, and I've also attached a worksheet that takes us through all these steps. I like to use the analogy that we are building a skeleton, but in order to build a skeleton, we first need to gather bones. So doing line by line coding identifies our initial codes, which I like to refer to as just the bones. When we move from initial coding to focus codes, which is our second step, we ask ourselves 2 questions. What are the most frequent and what are the most significant initial codes? And if we can't find that in our data, then we go back and we do more line by line coding. And so imagine having a bunch of bones identified and laid out in front of you, and you're asking yourself the question, what are the most significant bones and what are the most frequent bones that I'm finding in this skeleton? And that's how you devise your strategies for applying and developing focus codes. So focus codes clump together and they indicate that a category is developing. So certain kinds of bones belong together. So we gather all the foot bones together, we gather all the hand bones together, and we gather all the knee bones together. Then we develop subcategories for each category, and we use this doing any analytic tools that work. So we're going to learn a series of analytic tools. We're going to learn about diagramming. We're going to learn about mapping. We're going to learn about memoing. We're going to learn about free writing. All sorts of categories and strategies that all sorts of strategies that we're going to use to develop these subcategories. So we're going to look at the properties and dimensions of each category. So what are the properties of a foot bone? What do those look like? What do those feel like? What are the characteristics of them versus a knee bone? So replace that with some category that you are developing for your own project. And then we show the linkage of how the subcategory is related to this category. And we do this again using the same analytic tools. We can use a variety of tools for a variety of things. So for example, the tools that we're learning later on in the semester, sometimes memoing works really well as an analytic tool. Sometimes diagramming works better as an analytic tool, depending on your project and depending on which stage and phase that you are at in the project. So it gives us a series of analytic tools, but also allows us for a certain level of flexibility to use those tools. Last stage of coding is called theoretical coding, and this shows possible relationships between categories. So this helps us to tell the whole analytic story. So an analogy I like to use for this is that it gives us coherence. So for example, this sort of is the muscular structure that wraps around the skeleton and brings it to life. So this is where we code to analyze, not to summarize. So in comparison to initial coding, which is what we're doing today, we are looking at things more theoretically, more abstractly, rather than more descriptively, which is the first level coding phase. And symbolic interactionism gives us this implicit theoretical structure. So back to line by line coding, our very first step. So we are going to be learning a process of applying gerunds, which is also known as process coding. So gerunds is a noun focused on action. So that's kind of a funny way to think about it, but it's really derived from a verb. But in our phrase, it functions as a noun. So it's a central part of our coding process. It keeps us more connected to the person and the action of the person. So it keeps us from making leaps. It keeps us from labeling. It keeps us from applying an existing concept or theory before we really understand what's going on in the data. Because we want to answer this magic question, which is what is happening here in the data, in this small segment of data. And later on, we ask ourselves more theoretical questions like, what does it mean? But at this stage, we're seeing what's happening in this person's life, in this moment, in this setting, and the messages that they're trying to convey through their story and what actions they were taking. I just want to focus on the idea that Kathy Sharmaz, because of our constructivist theoretical underpinnings, takes the position that coding is emergent. So it's happening right now. It's happening as a result of our interaction with the data. So this interview took place weeks ago, but what is happening now in the data is important. So we take a very presently oriented approach to coding our data. So as constructivists, we're not pretending that we are not human. So my coding can change over time. So if I'm coding, in my basement without any windows with a headache, my coding can look very different than if I'm, in a beautiful room with chocolate and have a breeze blowing in and it's a lovely day. So it emerges as we interact with our data, and we as human beings are constructing the process of coding, which means it can change over time, which is actually one of the great reasons to work in teams, because it helps us to avoid projecting or allowing our mood or what's going on in our lives to creep into the coding process, which is why in class, we're going to take a team-based approach to coding. So we want to stay focused on the participants' points of view. So we look through their eyes. So we're looking at what's happening from their perspective, from their standpoint. Where are they in their situation? They're in the foreground, we're in the background at this point. And so we go where they go. We go where the data goes. So we can start out asking questions in one direction of our data and end up in a different place. So this is why we're always looking at the way our coding is in relation to our aims. Because remember, our large scale research aims, which are connected to our research proposal, have the ability to change over time. And sometimes that happens based on our coding process. So we need to pay attention to participants' language. Language is incredibly important. So for example, we look at repetitively used words. So I was one time interviewing for a study on older adults, and they kept on using words like awkward and complaints to talk about things that were, human rights. So it made me attune to the fact that there was like a power differential in the caregiving situation. So we want to really look at the words and the language that people use to describe their current situation, because that gives us kind of a key into the insight of their world. So to talk about things that are just normal and call them complaints lets us know their position. So as constructivists, we're interested in what people say. We don't make these large scale theoretical leaps. We want to understand how the person understands their world. And in coding, we're applying our own description. We are not interpreting at this level. We do that later on. At first, we describe, then we analyze. So something I'll be coaching you on in class is that we have to stay close to the data. Don't go far out, don't go abstract at this point, stay very close to your data. So the action, words, applying gerunds. So good technique matters because time is needed to practice. So feel free with your coding, particularly in the beginning, to code and then recode. Read, go back and forth between your transcripts and the readings for this week, because we happen as human beings to have this danger of projection. We don't want to project existing theories, existing knowledge onto our data at this point. Staying close to the data and applying these gerunds is actually what helps us build stronger bones. And then we can play around with theorizing later on. But Anson Strauss, Juliet Corbin, and Sharmaz all say there is no replacement for good initial coding, because it gives us the confidence to be able to experiment later with all of our theory building. So we must study our data. We have to code, recode. We consider our first round codes to be temporary or provisional. But this structure or this technique gives us boundaries. And it's an emergent process. So why did these codes come out of this session? How did our interaction with our analytic teammates change our ideas around our coding and help us to recode? So that's what I hope out of this class, is that our team-based approach gives us new insights, new meanings, and it often helps challenge what we think we know about our data and helps us to avoid projecting. Often as outsiders who have expertise in our fields of nursing or social work or public health, we import an alien professional language to describe a phenomenon that's grounded in our professional careers, that's grounded in what we know about theory. We don't want to do that at this stage. So we want to be careful to also not take participants, what Kathy Sharmaz calls orchestrated impressions, at face value. So this can lead to what is called outsider analysis. And we want insider analysis. So we want to be critical, not criticize what people say, to see if we can pull out a deeper understanding. So sometimes the most interesting data and interviews come from people making contradictions. And that's just an example, is that, we want to believe what people are telling us, but we also want to see when things have a double meaning. We also want to see when someone says one thing in a moment and then another thing in another moment, because that gives us way to understanding attention. And that leads us to greater theorizing, greater ability to analyze. So how do we keep ourselves on track to knowing all of these things and having all these ideas floating around in our heads on how to, build good bones, do good initial coding? We want to think of this level approach. So the first level is description. Then we do analysis, and then we do interpretation. We want to stick to the coding doing line by line initial coding. We want to do rich coding, which means we want to apply a lot of codes. So when you see my coding this week in class, you're going to see that I literally code every phrase at this stage because I don't want to miss anything. I want to make sure that our codes fit the data and not the other way around, which is difficult. And we also want to think about old news versus new news. And this helps us find a way to honor data collection because there's a lot of data out there in the world. So why are we collecting new data? And so we don't want to, old news is what, existing theory tells us. We want to understand what's happening to build new theory, taking on this approach. So we want to look at theory that's grounded in the data, meaning that we have to link our claims to something in the data. Otherwise, we're just seeing too much of ourselves in the data process. So later on, when we start making claims about our data, we're going to say, data point A, B, C, and D, which are really sections of your transcript, point to this claim that I'm making. The good news is that this is hard work, takes a lot of effort, but you may find a hole in your data that leads us to more of a covert meaning that leads to a new discovery. And that's what this process is all about. So we do rich coding. So applying gerunds forces us to do rich coding. It helps us to avoid judging. It helps us to utilize symbolic interactionism and pragmatism. It's our task to make analytic sense of our materials related to the study. And we make sense of what's going on in the person's world and what they said. Later on, we're looking for fit and relevance. And these are two terms aimed at building theory. So we want to make sure our study fits the empirical world of our participants through the codes that we've constructed at the initial coding stage. And later on, we're looking for relevance when we have an analytic framework that crystallizes participants' experiences. So pay close attention to those two words, fit and relevance. She also brings up this really wonderful thing called the ability to use in vivo codes. And what Kathy Sharma says is that these are symbolic markers. They give us insights into the person's world. These are their assumptions, deeper insights into their motivations. So, for example, over the hill is something that can be used as an in vivo code. It makes an assumption about a person's age. And, of course, that's derogatory and whatever, but if somebody keeps referring to themselves as over the hill, that is indicating a symbolic marker. Another example is, she yapped at him. So a little dog yaps. So if someone's telling a story and saying, that person yapped at him, that indicates something is going on at more of a symbolic level. And it's okay to look confused at this point. These become more explicit as we are coding our data. But if something jumps out to you as something that is a symbolic marker, it could be involved in the local language. It could be involved in a really interesting action somebody took or a really interesting way that somebody used to describe. We want to hold on to those as in vivo codes. So when we find an in vivo code, how do we analyze it? So we sort of create it, we sort of create a puzzle out of it. So we consider these as the golden key that gets us to the buried treasure underground. So when we find an in vivo code, we assume that there's assumptions behind us, and those assumptions give us insight into someone's actions. So we problematize them, we treat them as a puzzle that we have to solve. So we look for meaning, an explicit meaning. So what did this person mean by X, Y, and Z? This helps us to ask questions of the data, and we ask ourselves these particular set of questions around in vivo codes. So how did this person construct this in vivo code? Where are they coming from? What did they mean by this? Have I seen this before? How did, let's say the participant is female, she act? What action did she take based on this meaning? What were the consequences? How did it fit in the larger story? What is it linked to? So if we can answer all those questions, that means that we've found a great in vivo code that might have some theoretical traction later on. Which brings us to Zeldania's rendering of coding. And I really love this chapter, and I find that students really love this chapter because it sort of links us to a different way of understanding gerunding, and it helps us just incorporate a new voice into, the choir. So far, we've been really heavily linked to Sharmaz's rendering of coding, but bringing in Saldana at this point, I think is really helpful for an additional explanation about what coding is. So cycle 1 coding is the same thing as what Sharmaz is talking about. It's called initial coding. So what he's saying is you're breaking your data into little fragments and trying to get a sense of what's here. It's basically like you're laying everything out on the table. Later on, cycle 2 coding is everything after initial coding or focused coding. That's where you make piles and a category is starting to form. So that forces us to look deeper into the category using additional analytic strategies. He calls this process coding. So he's saying we're looking at movement over time. We're looking at what people do. And this can be at 2 levels. So people say a lot of stuff. People often contradict themselves, defending self, staking a claim. So notice that those are 3 gerunds. So contradicting self, defending self, staking a claim. And you can say that you can look at those carefully and say, oh, these aren't just what people are doing, meaning like their bodies are in motion. These are actually what people are doing in their talking. So this is important to think about, and it takes some practice. As we consider gerunds to happen on 2 levels, or process coding to happen on 2 levels. It's observable. So somebody's saying they're reading, they're playing, they're running, they're walking, they're cooking. Those are observable actions. Those are reported actions. Well, we're looking at things that are happening on a more conceptual level. So things like struggling, negotiating. These are higher level, more abstract things that people are doing in their talking and in their storytelling. So Saldana says we need to do, and so do Corbin and Strauss, at least 10 interviews with a very detailed line-by-line coding in order to be able to have enough analytic traction to be able to reach up higher to focus codes, to theoretical codes. And then we'll go on later in our, when we've developed our focus codes, then we can collect more data and then really just overlay our focus codes on the data. Focus coding is easier, in my opinion, than the initial coding. Initial coding is a lot of work. So that brings us to the end of our session for this week. Please reach out to me with any questions that you have around initial coding or around the coding of your transcripts. And I hope you all have a really great time with your coding process.